All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will call this City of Central City Council workshop to order. Our invocation and pledge of allegiance. I don't see our... Would anybody like to volunteer for the invocation? Councilman Evans will volunteer to do the invocation, and we'll follow that by the pledge of allegiance.
Let's pray. Hello. All right. Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together today to discuss the business of the city. We ask that you give us all wisdom as we discuss these things and know that what we're doing is trying to better the city. We ask that all the citizens that are present keep in mind that we're trying to do something to improve the city. In this we ask in your name, amen.
Amen. All right, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, roll call, please.
Here.
Cornell.
Here.
Lazarus.
Here.
McKinney.
Here.
Myers.
Here.
Roy.
Here.
Wells.
All right, we do have a quorum. Briefly, just to explain the procedure, this is a workshop, so the normal rules of the council aren't in play. A workshop is a more free to speak and have more open discussion on items. We do ask, if you want to speak, to please come to the microphone up here so that everybody can hear you. And if you do speak at the podium when you're finished, if you please go over to Ms. Mouton's table and sign in so that we have a record of everyone who spoke. All right, the item that we're here for is number 1, to review and receive public input on a proposed ordinance amending the City of Central Comprehensive Zoning Code, allowing conditional uses in the Rural Agriculture Zoning District. Sponsor, Council Member Evans. I'll turn it over to Council Member Evans, but I do just want everyone to know our city planner, Steve Villavasso, is to my right, and our zoning attorney, Mark Balkin, is somewhere. There he is, right there. So both of them are here to answer any questions. All right, Councilman Evans.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This process started probably a year ago, and the idea being that Central was founded. We were a suburb of East Baton Rouge Parish. There are many businesses that are in Central. A couple of them I worked at as a teenager and through high school that began out on rural tracts of land. Dan Chase Taxidermy was one of them. Trade Construction started on Dem Road behind Mr. Will Beasley's house. Davis & Sons Body Shop. I grew up next door to it. And when I was early in my political career, I thought we were making it harder for small businesses by not allowing them to do what they were allowed to do even 20 years ago. And so it began a conversation with the zoning attorney and our staff, and throughout that process, I would get phone calls from people who this would affect, And so the idea was we went through the classification codes of all the businesses, and the rural ag zone already has commercial use in it. So I just went through and said, okay, does this make sense if it was an allowed or conditional use? Does this make sense? And that's where we came up with the list. We debated it and discussed it. Me and the P&Z commissioner discussed it at length. We went through and played devil's advocate with each one. We stipulated no retail. We stipulated that the property had to be owner occupied. My intent was that the change would only be allowed for the owner occupant of the house and the business. And it seems from having conversation with our city planner and our staff that the better way to go about doing this may not be to change the use code or the use code in our ordinance, but to look at changing our home-based business law, which is it's somewhat silly to me because it says you can have a home-based business, but you can't have employees and you can't operate it out of an accessory structure. So it's like, I mean, and you're really not supposed to have customers. So the piano teacher, you know, can she teach kids at her house? She has customers. If that's the case, how do we deal with that? The air conditioning guy on 2 or 3 acres can't have a couple trucks and employees come to his house. And my idea was, it just didn't make sense. And so that's what began this whole process. Now, after a very good conference call with our planner, it seems we may need to go in a different direction to solve the problem. And Matt actually had an intern with IBTS do some research of similar cities to Central across the country. They have a tiered approach. In other words, tier 1 would be a very minimal impact business, maybe internet sales, no customers, no deliveries, whatever. Tier 2 would be something a little more intrusive that would need to go through the process of approval. Tier 3 would be that which probably would only be sufficient in a rural ag zone. You wouldn't want an air conditioning company with 2 or 3 trucks in your neighborhood with him having 2 or 3 trucks parked in his driveway and cars parked in the road. Well, you know, so it's the idea is to how do we allow it without causing issues with the neighbors and so forth. And that's the whole reason we've come here tonight, because there was support, but not enough as it was written, and a workshop was asked for, and so the idea is let's have this workshop. Let's come up with a workable solution that can get this done, and let's move forward. And so I thank you all for coming, and we can open up the discussion.
So, just some thoughts on, thank y'all for hanging out here. How about now?
You might get it.
All right, that better? Okay. So, yeah, Wade, thank you for starting the conversation and getting this pulled together. So, just to open it up, some of the feedback that I got is, how do we ensure the property owner rights for the person who has the land and wants to operate the business without negatively affecting those that may be in close proximity to the business? So, I don't know if this particularly addresses it or not, but I mean, okay, so you got visual line of sight type things. Can you see the business? Is that impacting my quality of life as the neighbor next to that business? Can I hear that business? Can I smell that business? Are there any tactile senses that I'm going to be as the person who lives next to this business, and how do they affect me? So one of the first ones that I pulled up, and please, I am not a zoning attorney and haven't read through it, but I pulled up the performance standards for sound. And the way that our code is written now, correct me if I'm wrong, whether you're in residential or rural ag, from 7 to 10, you can emit 70 decibels from your property. And then on residential or rural ag, from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., you can emit 65. To me, this ordinance doesn't change that at all, correct?
No, and look, I think this ordinance, if we approach it from the home-based business, this ordinance will just be done away with.
Okay.
So the intent was to discuss this ordinance, but if we're going to change direction, which after a conversation with Matt, the enforcement of changing directions is better. And Mr. Villabasso, can you expound on this?
Is my mic working?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Okay, well, can you hear me now? Okay, it's better. Got to get real close. You told me to get close. Do it. Oh, you touch it, it doesn't work? Okay, you can hear me now. Okay, I have a disease. The disease is long answers. I'm going to try to avoid that, okay? So my short answer, and this is a good place to start, and your zoning attorney, your city attorney obviously has to weigh in here, and I'm not here as an attorney, although I am an attorney, right, Mark? I'm here as your city planner. All other ordinances always apply when you enact a new set of land use regulations. So your sound ordinance is going to be your sound ordinance. Your signage code is going to be your signage code. What you do here doesn't change that, okay? So that is absolutely, in my opinion, underlying the entire discussion here. So that's my short answer on this issue, okay? So I wouldn't say don't worry about that. Yes, worry about it, because whatever you end up doing is going to be based on some sort of performance standards, but those performance standards have to work with your existing laws.
So, obviously, the utmost importance is protecting the landowner's rights on both sides of the issue. All right. I want you to be able to use your property as you see fit without intruding on your neighbor's sanity. I think that's the key here. So, if we're going to do anything, we have to have a set of standards. And so, where does that start? You know, do we look, okay, so tier one, but, you know, I don't even know where you would start with the tiers. I know we have home schools out here that may get more traffic than people are comfortable with. We have in-home daycares that, you know, people are allowed to do, I guess, and I don't want to restrict that because they provide a service. There are families that want their kids to stay at a house with an in-home caregiver, and there are people who need to provide an income for themselves, so they keep 6 or 7 kids. That needs to be allowed. The lady who teaches music lessons, there needs to be a way for that to happen. So is that a tier 1 business? And do you put the types of businesses in tier 1, or do you put a criteria of how many cars do you have, or how many cars are parked at the site? I mean, I don't know where you would start with that. The other, obviously, would be, you know, the neighborhoods have HOAs, that the ones that are managed, they're going to stipulate what they can do in their neighborhoods. You can't go in Bellingraph Lakes and do this if Bellingraph Lakes doesn't allow it in their covenants. Comede Hills actually had a lawsuit a few years ago that they won because I think it was a barber shop or something, and they said, no, you cannot operate a barber shop in our neighborhood. It's in the covenant. So they won. The judge, you know, said they were right. So then what becomes a tier 2 business? You know, so I don't know. That's what, Matt, did you do any further research, and did you get anything printed out?
We dug into the Zachary code a little bit more today, and I believe Steve kind of worked on that in the past, but they have kind of a 2-tier system. But we may want to dig into it a little bit more and see, you know, if this is the approach you want to take, you know, if these criteria would work for Central or not. But basically what they do is they have a home occupation tier that's very similar to what we have now on the books, but they do allow some uses, as I guess they call it home business. They allow those in an accessory building if you get a conditional use permit, and there's certain restrictions they have about numbers of vehicles and equipment and screening and that sort of thing. So I think there probably needs to be discussion if that's the direction you want to go, what kind of criteria you would want to look at between these classes.
Okay.
So that's what I wanted to ask. So I've got the code pulled up right here. So I mean, right off the bat. So I'm thinking about like my place. Okay, so I've got a barn. I want to do some kind of rural ag business out of my barn. Right now, it's kind of maybe iffy. It doesn't meet one of the things, but that would qualify as an accessory building, right, Matt? Yes. So right now, I'm already breaking our code of ordinances if I do anything out of that building, other than keep animals. I mean, so that's something that I think we would have to address, not only as maybe a companion ordinance to, you know, whatever we decide to do with the home-based business side, but in terms of, you know, our code's going to have to be updated as well. I mean, you keep reading, it says, you know, no signs, you can only have a 2 square foot area, sign not exceeding excluding 2 square feet. So you can't have a sign any bigger than this on the building. So is that the kind of thing we want to keep, change, put out?
I mean, honestly, I don't see an issue why you would need signage on your building. I mean, the idea, if you want to go that far, then it's probably time for you to get a building. I mean, and get into a commercial zone. The issue, as this ordinance is written, Mr. Ball, can it be restricted on any of these that it's not a conditional use permit for the property, the conditional use is for the applicant? Because I never intended and don't want it to be to where if Mr. Smith has a conditional use to run his electrical company and his service company with 3 or 4 trucks, I don't want if Mr. Smith dies for his family to be able to sell it and then another electrical company coming.
So, yeah, I'm forming my thoughts. So generally, land use follows the property. It doesn't follow the owner. So, is there a way under, home occupations that it has to be, the person who is occupying the property, that it's their business? The answer is yes, because it's a home occupation. And I would assume if we did a tiered approach, it would be a home business. So it would have to be that. But again, the home business comes with a conditional use permit, at least in Zachary, and this was drafted with conditional use permits. And I wanted to add something to what Steve said before, to your question about sound, and the whole idea of a conditional use permit, that it's a conditional use instead of a permitted use, is because there are going to be places where this particular business or this particular type of use in whatever zone is completely appropriate. And then there are places where it might not be appropriate. So I'll give you an example. You have a business zone, but a commercial zone that backs up onto a residential area. So you might not want to allow somebody to have a drive-through bank or a drive-through restaurant on that piece of property where, a half a block or 3 blocks down where it's not right behind, right in front of residential, that type of a use might be appropriate. So that's why we make things conditional uses, is so that you can look at that particular property and make sure that it's an appropriate use on that particular property. And that is how we were approaching
But
this.
we also don't want to add it to the condition. In other words, I don't want a plumber to be able to go buy 3 acres in the rural ag zone just to operate his business. The idea is if you're living there and you have the space and you build a building and you want to run your small business, how do we make that work, but not allow just anybody to go buy 3 acres and open a plumbing business in the rural zone without living there?
Well, I think that you have to make it a home business or a home occupation. I think you would have to make it a home business so that it's somebody who's living on the property, that it's their business. But I don't think if they were to sell the business, if somebody were to pass away and the family were to want to sell the business with the house, I think that the next owner would be able to do that too. They would have a conditional use permit for it. So,
Wouldn't we want them to have to apply for it so they understand, hey, you're agreeing to do this?
well, as long as the business doesn't cease for 6 months, they'd be able to continue doing it because a conditional use permit runs with the land. It doesn't run with the owner.
TJ.
Currently, in the home-based business, it says owner occupant. Currently, in the home-based business ordinance, it says owner occupant only. Is there some way we could take out the only, but that's like we put in this ordinance?
Yes.
The owner has to live there.
The home-based business law that we have says you can't have any employees that do not live at the residence.
Correct, and I'm saying maybe we could strike
With
the
that,
doesn't live there,
yeah,
you can't
and
have them.
Maybe your tier 1 would be, you don't have any employees. Tier 2, if you have an employee or two, then it goes.
Right,
to
and you
scrutiny.
made eye contact with me about that, because the rural ag, really, the reason I got behind this was because of the rural ag, and I believe a lot of what we had on that list only belongs in rural ag.
I agree.
It doesn't, so instead of a tiered system that's 1, 2, or 3, or whatever you want to call it, is there some way we could look at the underlying zoning to look at the tiered, because an R3 zoning is a lot closer together houses versus an R1 versus a rural ag. And I mean, we may be able to have some kind of a tiered system to where you're looking at the size of the lots versus just this is okay, or then you've got to step up to that and then that.
This is, as this was proposed, I mean, it's, and I'm not taking an opinion about whether this is, I'm not taking an opinion about whether this is a great idea or not, but as this was written, this is an amendment to the RA district conditional use list.
Yes.
So it's not something that would be a conditional use in an R1 or an R2 or.
Yes.
But he's talking about changing.
Right, but you could have home occupations and home businesses that are only in the RA district that are different from home occupations and home businesses that would be available in other districts.
But I think the issue is I don't want the conditional use to stay with the property. The idea is not to stay with the property.
It's just not the way zoning works. You can't. It's a land use, and it's not a personal use. Steve, I don't know if you have a different way of saying that.
I don't have a different way of saying that. Actually, we talked about this in the conference calls we had earlier this week, and one of the ideas, and obviously you and Cherry have to weigh into this, is maybe a 2-tier system. And I know we keep talking about tiers, and mentally, I'm thinking of the Zachary approach. Although, what's good for Zachary doesn't mean it's good for Central. I know that rule of life. But we wrote the Zachary tiered system, and it is based on a home office versus a home business. And the home office is based on a set of standards that we embed into the ordinance. And one of the standards was a occupation license, which is granted to a person, not a piece of land. I know, you know. And the home office was really a performance standard that could be administered administratively. Okay, if you met the standards in the home office under the Zachary Code, the essentially the staff of the planning department and the permit folks could give you a permit for a home office. But if you tipped into the home business, which is a much more intense use, which might fit several of the categories in this proposed ordinance, and obviously some of these are plain vanilla zoning changes, okay? Slaughterhouses, okay? And I got a copy of this 2 weeks ago. Under the home business approach, more intensity include the business occupation to get around or to layer in the fact that we want to tie it to a home occupation, and if that person's home occupation license expires, maybe that standard dissolves. But the home business is equivalent to a conditional use permit in Zachary. It goes through the whole gamut. It goes through the staff review, planning commission, vote of the city council, subject to veto, back to the city council to veto. So that is a high level of review and control once you reach that tier, we've talked about tiers several times tonight already, and that's a two-tiered system. It seems to be working in Zachary. That doesn't mean it's going to work in Central, but it's a model. We always don't want to reinvent the wheel. If we find one out there, maybe we can modify it. So that's sort of, this is a two-tier approach. One is administrative approval. The second is a full-blown legislative approval. Mark and I and Sherry might say it is a zoning change. A conditional use approval is equivalent to changing the zoning. Without changing the zoning and acknowledging that there is a use that might be appropriate on a piece of property if you met the standards, if you reviewed it with the public, if the planning commission recommended approval, if the council looked at it in terms of the master plan and protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the community, standard stuff that I always talk about, and voted to give you a conditional use permit. The word permit really is not appropriate. Conditional use authority based on all those standards. And so those standards could be, blended into a new version of the approach here, which I think could include an occupation license requirement. And I think it needs some more discussion and thinking. But that to me, and I agree with Mark's basic premise, and I actually made that speech on the phone the other day. You remember that, Councilman Evans? Yes. Almost the same words that Mark used. And we came to this, I think, a possible creative approach to include both the person as a whole, as an occupation type of use, and giving the community the right level of review to make sure that surrounding properties are protected, maybe above and beyond the sound code that you have now, because Mark alluded to this, is you could put conditions in a conditional use approval that are more stringent than your sound ordinance, okay? If your sound ordinance says 70 decibels, and I don't even know what that is, I'm not a sound person, and this was a sensitive area with a quiet residential neighborhood, the standard might be 90 decibels. And it would be a case-by-case basis, but this approach doesn't go through every one of the uses you imagine. It sets standards for anything that comes before you to see if the standards can be met. I was picking on slaughterhouse before because I've done slaughterhouses.
Where do slaughterhouses go in a city?
They
do you
go
put them in the middle, or do you put them in a rural zone?
You want them in a rural area, and you want to be able to put them under a lot of scrutiny to make sure there's a lot of protection for the neighbors.
Yeah,
okay,
look,
I've done slaughterhouse zoning
the
before.
Slaughterhouse thing. So a little background.
No offense if you have a slaughterhouse.
We talked about abattoirs, which is a very boutique type deal where they just do a few animals.
Oh, it's like filet mignons?
It's
not
miniature cow.
I get it. Right.
No, but I mean, you've got people who process deer and make sausage.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking New Mexico feedlots with 100,000 head of cattle.
That's what people think about whenever they hear those words, but I get it.
So I'd like to make a few.
I got a list of things here, so get your pencil out. I think what you brought up, though, is there's already a Supreme Court case involving conditional use. Once you establish it, if somebody comes in within 6 months, they can continue to operate. So that's a very dangerous precedent. I've always been about protecting the rights of existing landowners. If we're going to do something that could affect somebody else next door to where these properties exist, and by the way, RA is not just what you envision out in the country. There's already zoning right here in the middle of the city. So what are your conditions on RA? Is it going to be excluding the city center? Do you have some boundaries set?
I think the city center already has an overlay district.
No, I'm not talking about the exact city center. Summers Road, my son lives right there. That's RA. That's dead in the middle of the city. You going to allow him to put a slaughterhouse there?
I mean, Mike, you're actually on the P and Z. Conditional use would go through the P and Z.
Wait, let me get finished with this and you'll understand where I'm coming from. Conditional use means conditions, okay? You got none listed on here. You got a list of stuff you want to do. I say none, very little. And you got no enforcement mechanism. You got people out here today running businesses everywhere. So how you going to get them in compliance? You're going to go around and say, now you need an occupational license? And by the way, you will always back fines because you've been operating outside of what we told you you can do, and it's already been brought to your attention. We changed rural ag from 3 acres back to 1. So now you got 1 acre plots where some of this stuff would apply. People move to RA districts for peace and quiet. So whatever you plan on doing here needs to keep that in mind. Are you going to go around and make people get an occupational license like Mr. Valdeso brought up? You know, like I said, I know of a lot of businesses here. So when you find them or you hear about them, you're going to have somebody at the compliance office say you got to go down to the city and get your occupational license. How do we monitor growth of these businesses to a point where they exceed what the conditional use is? And how are you going to make them get in compliance? I've seen businesses start out as occupied by just the owner and expand into multi-million-dollar businesses. And that was before we became a city, but it happens. The other thing is, as this stuff develops around, because I've seen this happen too, as you have new subdivisions or new developments come up around these already conditional use areas, are you going to force them out because now they're affecting the neighbors? I've seen racetracks. I've seen different things where subdivisions grow towards it, and now people start complaining about the noise, the traffic, and all the stuff that goes with it. So there's a lot of things. You got to look down the road at what you're doing here. Make sure you got something that controls or addresses those type issues.
So if I may, let me make some comments. A couple of things that I'm going to look at as guardrails. I'm not involved in the writing of this legislation, but would have to consider it. My first and foremost standard is, what are you doing to your neighbor? So whatever we write, I can't support anything that's going to degrade what the person bought their 1 or 2 or 3 acres for, whether that's screening or distance or restricting size, etc. Whatever we do, we have to protect the existing property owners. Home-based businesses, I heard discussion about, well, if somebody dies and somebody else buys a business. I'm sorry, by definition, these home-based businesses, they're portable. If you're an electrician, if you're running a plumbing shop and you want to sell your plumbing shop, you don't have to sell your property. Nobody's going to know where your plumbing truck was parked. So I can't see any of these being where they are makes a difference. If we're trying to create an environment where you know that if you go down Brown Road, you're going to find that plumbing shop, well then we've missed the boat. We need to restrict this to the things that doesn't matter where they are. The burden of proof on this is always going to have to be on the applicant. As we write whatever we're going to write here, I want to make sure the applicant is the one that has to come in and has a high standard of saying, this cannot affect my neighbor. It may be that we don't allow certain things unless you've got 25 acres and want to put your business in the middle of that 25 acres. I don't know what the answer is. Tied to the business, not the land, I won't support anything that ties to the land the right to operate a business on that piece of property. So we got to find a way, as far as my vote's concerned, not to allow us to grant land rights, rather business rights to that particular property owner. People say, well, if my plumbing business grows and now I've got 4 trucks and 6 employees, I've owned a business for 30-something years. There comes a point where you got to step up and go get a place to do business. So if we're talking about, well, it grew so much, well, then that's the time for you to move out. So I have some sympathy for the one or two person electrician or the guy that has acreage and parks some, a tree service. Park your equipment on your land, and you meet a couple employees and go out. I can understand that, but it comes a point at which, especially with labor-intensive and inventory-intensive businesses, where it's just not appropriate, and nobody can tell me that there's not a couple $1,000s a month to be able to rent a place once you have 5 or 6 or 7 employees. I think there were invisible businesses. I think, practicing being an accountant or keeping a child in a daycare or tutoring someone or teaching piano, I look at those as invisible. Nobody's going to know when and where they're happening. There needs to be our home-based business does need to be changed because it restricts the accessory buildings. I got my former business partner's got a studio behind his house where he plays music. He can't teach a guitar lesson there, I don't think, because it's in an accessory building. He can do it in his living room though. So we've got some silly things going on there. We need to make it easier for these small businesses to enjoy the lack of overhead, and that's what a lot of this comes down to, is just not having the overhead. And it makes it possible to do some things as a small business owner that you can't do, to go rent a studio or rent a warehouse. Other than the very small businesses, once we get to the point where we're impacting the neighbors, I just want to keep always going back to the idea that the neighbors' rights are going to have to come above the property owner's rights. You bought the property knowing it was rural ag. You bought the property knowing that you couldn't do a business there. Now we're trying to be a little more accommodating to people who want to do businesses. Well, you didn't buy it with an expectation of being able to run your plumbing shop there. So if we can find a way to make that acceptable, I'm all for it. I'm all for entrepreneurialism. But it's not an expectation, not a right.
Okay, I think in a roundabout way, what I'm going to say is going to second a little bit what you said.
Oh my gosh, me and Wayne?
Yeah, well, kind of, very, very little.
Get a calendar.
All right, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to say this. No, I believe that ordinances and laws are enacted to protect the people. That's what they're there for. In some of my conversations with my students at Baker High, I said, if there were not MPH signs on Groom Road, you would have that guy that would drive 90 miles an hour down there and down that street. And the why answer would be because there's nothing saying I can't. When I was on the council, got a phone call late one afternoon. I'm not going to say the subdivision. A gentleman called me up and said, I need help. Can you come? This is hard to believe. This household was having weddings and receptions at the house on a pretty regular basis. When I got there, the gentleman told me I've had enough. I can't take it anymore. Y'all, there were cars everywhere up and down the street. So I went and knocked on the door, and the homeowner came to the door. The first thing he did, he offered me a glass of Crown Royal, and I told him I didn't drink anymore. And so I explained to him that they were interfering with the people, the neighbors in the neighborhood. He said, well, I don't understand. He said, this is my house. I ought to be able to do what I want with it anytime I want. And I said, no, it doesn't work like that. So they quit having it. Now, they quit having them. Now, here's my last little statement. This is the only thing I'm kind of worried about if we get off track with what we have now. You've heard the saying before, give an inch, and somewhere along the way they're going to take a mile. And I'm going to leave you with my last story. I worked... No, this is it. This is my last one. Hey, you said there wasn't any time on it, so I'm going to say it. I taught and I coached my first 18 years. And boy, when I tell you we worked 7 days a week, we worked. And the only morning that I really got to sleep was Sunday morning. And every Sunday morning at 6 o'clock, my neighbor cut his grass. Every Sunday morning. Pretty good sized guy. So I asked him, I said, please do me a favor, can you wait till like 8 o'clock? It'll give me a couple little more hours and then I'll get up and go to church. He said, I'm overweight, I can't take the heat, I'm cutting the grass at 6 o'clock in the morning whether you like it or not. So I know I probably should have done this, but it was Monday morning, like about 1 o'clock in the morning. And I got up and my wife said, don't do what I think you're getting ready to do. He's going to kill you. So I went out, I got some of my firewood and I cranked up my chainsaw, boy, and I started cutting my wood. And that big rascal came out of that back door and he was coming towards me. And I think the only thing that pretty much saved me was I had a chainsaw. And so we came to a deal, agreement. He wouldn't cut the grass until 8 o'clock, and I wouldn't cut my wood until like 11 or 12 o'clock. And we became real good friends. So I don't know if that story's worth a dead gum or not, but I think you need to really consider what this is and make sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed. Because if you don't, you could wind up with a lot more problems than you thought you had. Thank you for listening to my stories.
Wayne, I think y'all were, under our current ordinances, I think y'all were both wrong.
Oh, I know. I know. Thank you very much.
Y'all, remember if you speak at some point, please sign in over there so we can just, you can do it after you speak. It's good. Just at some point before you leave.
Over here that we can put there.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. I live off of Highway 64.
A little closer.
I'm Allison Kessner, and I live off of Highway 64. I live off of Highway 64. I'm rural, about as rural as Central can get. Where it's zoned at with planning and zoning, you have office and research, you have commercial 1, commercial 5. Then I went back and I kind of looked at the 2007 maps when we first, how the flow of things there. My concern is with what I read online with these ordinances and everything, is that, as you said, that you feel like some businesses are portable. I have to disagree. You have LaFleur's Plumbing off of Greenville Springs Road. That's been there quite a number of years with a heavy amount of employees. You can't just look at them and say, oh, you have to adhere to these restrictions, because it would be restrictions to them. Or say the Indian Mound. They employ anywhere between 4 to 6 employees just in sight. That doesn't count the meat processing that goes on in the back. Other things that concern me is where I'm at. My land butts up to nothing but foreign cattle land. Okay, I believe the Wamax or the Millicent owns it. And they're behind me. One brother will never sell anything. It will always be for cattle. On the other end, on the other side of Georgia, the other brother's like, I'm selling everything. Well, then you have companies like Trade on Jor that employ hundreds of employees. So when you look at this business model, and I appreciate it because I am for constructive growth. I am for constructive businesses. I am for homegrown mom and pop businesses. I bought my property. You said one thing I do disagree with. I did buy my property in hopes of one day that my husband and he's a mechanic, to kind of take him out the shop and give him his own 1-2 bay, of course, little shop out front, bricked, in congruency with unified development codes, such as soundproofing, because we have neighbors. I have a neighbor to the left of me, and I have Mr. Clark across the street from me. I have another 2 neighbors on the other side of me. And when I do kind of have that same feeling of everyone wants to live how they want to live. As long as they're, treating their neighbor with the same respect as they would want to be treated, I feel like that should go into this model. I do disagree that you can't just impose ordinances on people that have been there for a number of years with employees and their businesses you've never heard a complaint on their businesses, their neighbors keep to themselves. I've never had a complaint about the, hundreds of head of cattle behind me. It's a beautiful sight in the morning. I've never had a complaint about getting my meat processed down the road at Indian Mound. I do want to see, home-based businesses be ran. You can't tell them how to run their businesses, but I do feel that you can put things in place that kind of counter any uncomfortableness with the neighbors. I'm looking into notary. My husband's a mechanic. We are zoned rural agriculture. Would say we were to come to the council and say, oh, well, we would like to do this with our property. I have, office and research here. Well, that covers me. Would I guess what I'm saying that would be more, would y'all take into consideration the zoning around my said property on how I would like to zone it? And that's what I had to say. I hope y'all take into consideration that there's already business owners. I haven't been around in about 5 years, so I'm not up to speed on y'all's planning, unified development code, if that's been updated in any way, or I know you've been working on drainage and everything, but I guess as this meeting progresses, I'll find out more. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Just to clarify one thing. The businesses that have been here for longer than Central, they can't be touched. I mean, people who already had the right to do business, Indian Mound, LaFleur's Plumbing, etc. I mean, they're grandfathered into what they're doing, and we're not going to be anything this council does. I don't think can go in unless somebody's intentionally been operating out of compliance for some number of short years. The ones that've been here forever, we're not touching them.
Yeah, I would just say that's called legal non-conforming, and communities always will recognize what's already there under that concept.
And as far as the, house land and the mechanic, that's kind of the under the home-based business. Someone said earlier about the accessory dwelling unit. I mean, I do agree that that's an issue, that you can't run a business out of an accessory dwelling unit. And then some of the businesses, even on the list, some of it I feel like is big government. I mean, I'm a teacher. If I want to tutor from my house, I have to get a permit. I mean, so I think we have to be careful too that we don't become like big brothers watching you at every moment, and there's some type of balance.
You got to go to the mic.
I guess one thing that didn't get addressed is how would y'all take into consideration a rural agriculturally zoned, say 30 acres like I have, and say I wanted to change my zoning? Would the zoning around it impact that or affect y'all's decision?
Well, we would look at the master plan and what the future land use is.
I mean, I personally think that it's not the zoning. We need to look at home-based. It's not so much changing zoning for everything. It's more about the home-based businesses and the type of home-based businesses.
Right, and so to your point, I want you to be able to do your notary work and your husband to have his mechanic shop. The way that things are right now, that's not permitted.
I did call them and they said I had about 50 shots.
Allison, if you keep talking out of the mic, you're going to be asleep.
I'm sorry, I was trying to answer your question. Look, we're trying, but I mean, I think the point of everyone discussing this is trying to figure out how to make something that makes sense for it. Also, I looked up, so it looks like the plumbing is land use C, and what is land use PSB? I'm not familiar with that one. PSB for Indian Mound is what? You'll get Indian Mound, and it's PSB.
says existing land use BSD.
I think it stands for public something, public something.
Well, that's where our Indian Mountain substation is, so.
Those are some of those retained districts where the council at the time, the zoning code and map was passed. There are some, we have our zoning code.
Let's go to the Mike.
We have our zoning code, and we have the zoning districts that are in the zoning code. And I believe it happened on the night that the zoning code was passed. There were certain properties that were able to retain their EBR zoning. Some of those I know. Some of those I know with staff were looking to propose changes to bring them within our zoning, but
Yeah,
there's
just like LaFleur's is rural ag, but land use C.
Yeah, well, yeah. See, people came to the council that night and begged for their existing zoning, probably without even looking at what they were going to be zoned. And I don't know if it was on some of them or on all of them. I actually wasn't at that meeting. They retained zoning under the EBR, and of course, you know, EBR's regulations have changed since then. So I don't know if it's retained zoning as it was that day. Okay, so I cringe every time one of those properties comes and I have to do something with it. So.
Hi, I'm Pam Mitchell, and I actually live in a very dense neighborhood that's zoned RA. So that is a problem. I've discussed this with Wade. I'm glad to hear that you're maybe thinking of moving away from that classification, because we don't have the home associations that would restrict or anything like that. And as I've explained, it's a very narrow street. Whatever you do, I think there needs to be a lot of attention to detail, because one of the things I was told, well, if the neighbors object, but is it one neighbor or two neighbors or 10 neighbors? You know, how many count for the poor planning and zoning men or women that sit on that board trying to decide what to do? And the other thing I would say, if you're going to codify things into ordinances and laws, they're going to be pretty stuck and have to go with what you say. What you have said is legal for them to do. So I just think the whole thing needs to be thought through probably a whole lot more, particularly with where y'all are looking at going into another direction, and to consider the people that live on their property and have lived there for many years. Thank you.
Harry Rawls. I'd just like to mention a few of these things here. When I moved to Central, I moved into a neighborhood, and I owned a business and had an office. But when I went into my house, I built a 4th bedroom, and I now call that my home office. And I have neighbors that say, "Hey, what are you complaining about running a business? Because you run a business there." I said, "Yeah, but I pay my tax every year, and now I'm retired, don't have it, but it's still a home business." So that's okay. Now we're talking about going to a rural, okay? Let's take for example, I don't see, even in my house there, though, I know that I don't want anybody in my neighborhood running a business out of it, for the simple fact that you haven't set any hours of business in this. You haven't set any maximum lot sizes. You're telling me that I can have dancing and music there. Well, if they're at dancing and all that about 10 o'clock, those old folks are going to bed. And a fire and police station, that's a 24-hour business. So some of these things are just totally out of whack. You haven't considered a post office? Yeah, I don't think so. And a livestock research, definitely no. So I'm just saying.
But someone always like, what if I want to do livestock research? I'm in the middle of nowhere and I can only bother trees and power lines.
Well, that's fine. You were there when it all came around. Maybe if the neighborhood, you're there before a neighborhood comes in. I got no objection to that. I just want you to make sure that when you define a home office, that it should have operating hours, I think, because I don't want the donut shop lady doing donuts over there, and she's up 4 o'clock in the morning cooking and banging. And I've got one guy in my neighborhood that
this wouldn't apply to your neighborhood.
No, I know.
In any of the tiered approaches, I don't think you could run any consumer-based type business out of your neighborhood.
Well, I totally agree, but if I'm running a bakery shop, you're not gonna let them come pick up the donuts and stuff in any hours?
I mean, it's retail. That's retail.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
This
I'm
is
just
explicitly
using it as an
retail.
example of these things will come up. That's what I'm thinking. And dancing and music lessons, if they're doing that at home, they can be doing that all night long. And I want to be hearing music. But so what I say is at least look at something of at least a minimum size if they're going to be a certain type of business.
Mr. Mayor, I didn't mean to cut you off earlier. I apologize for that. But I think that goes back to the intent is to respect the people that are next to the business, whether it be conditional use. And I guess can we throw out RA now? And we're only talking more towards the home base.
I mean, I'm good with whatever. I think so. Page 1, line 41, recognized residential subdivisions. All right, so any of this is excluded in a recognized residential subdivision.
Yeah, well, I understand. I'm just using these as examples of if they're in my hearing distance or seeing distance, or
that's it.
We got a lot of old people in this city, believe me.
Yes.
And,
in order to respect those people, I just want to make sure that the examples are accurate to the context of what we're talking about.
See, of course, I'm against that commercial way we got it now. You know, we now have a Dollar General right next to backing up to a subdivision there. Now here come the trucks 24 hours a day in and out. I'm against that. So I just want you to at least put some controls on there where you can make decisions on the spot of what it might affect in the surrounding areas. So basically, I guess what I'm asking.
Yeah, standards.
So I would encourage us, if this recognized residential subdivision stays in this ordinance in whatever form it ends up, we got to be careful because a residential subdivision means property that's been subdivided is a subdivision, and what is quote recognized. And so we got a real big gray area there as to whether you take a 5-acre property on Brown Road and subdivide it into 5 lots. That's technically a residential subdivision. So we need to be careful to define that a little better before we go forward.
So
6 lots, fine.
So that would make it a recognized subdivision, right?
That term is pretty nebulous.
Not former tract of, but a named subdivision.
Right, but if you go to, if somebody goes to split up.
Everything's going to be individually. Things are going to come up. Somehow you need to put it before a committee to recognize how it's going to affect.
We need to list the subdivisions if we're going to do that. Let's be specific.
Well, there's already a definition for recognized subdivision in our
Yeah,
code.
it says down at the bottom, recognized subdivisions means any recorded subdivision containing more than 5 lots for residential use, but not necessarily single family. So, I mean, it was described in the ordinance.
It's in the UDC or the development code, but it's for subdivision purposes.
Right. So does any 5 houses off of one lane automatically become a recognized subdivision?
No.
No, they're indicated on your zoning map. These official subdivisions are actually indicated on the map.
I have it here.
Oh, okay. No, I was thinking, so I think both Mike and Mr. Harry both said, long term, what is the impact of this? So I'm trying to think, you've got 5 lots on a road. Does that become a subdivision? And let's say somebody doesn't want that business next to you. What is the what is the future impact of doing it?
Well, so you have an issue with any city. All right, Central is 62.8 square miles. North of Hooper is typically RA and very rural. South of Hooper is our more urbanized, more dense areas. At some point, you're going to get sprawl, and so do you then? Let's use what's allowed in RA now. Let's say a guy's running cattle on his property. Do you then don't let him run cattle because they want to build a neighborhood next to it and they don't want to smell cow manure? I mean, at what point? So now we're impeding on one person's property rights that's been existing fine for the growth. So I don't know how you deal with that. I think as sprawl happens, that's going to happen. So I think you have to limit your development to areas where the infrastructure is, and that is we set those laws. We're the ones that say no. You can build a neighborhood and put a private wastewater for 132 houses. I think we need to have no. If we don't have sewer there, then no, you can't. But we also have to get more proactive about where do we want development to happen in our city and put the sewer infrastructure in place and then keep everything else rural.
Yeah, so question, I see that, section 12.2 under RA, it says a conditional use is breeding, raising, or keeping of livestock is a conditional use. I thought you could have livestock.
But you can't train horses. We have had cases we've turned down that they wanted to have a horse training business.
By keeping it, right? Without a conditional use?
You can't board them or train them.
What if they're not? So I want to.
No, if you're yours, but if you're charging for the boarding, I was talking about horse boarding or horse training. And that's kind of why I said earlier is where else are you going to do horse boarding or horse training? Legally, I can't have it anywhere but RA, but I got to turn it commercial, which is spot zoning if you get a big enough tract of land for me to be able to do that. And it's not really where I want to see a B3 business associated because we do zone land, not for a individual business. And that was kind of where I was going with that earlier. We need to maybe look at the underlying zoning as our tiered system. And the ones that do belong in RA, that's your, whatever tier.
Yeah, because I truly believe that the things in this don't belong anywhere but RA. I mean, and look, I even saw a comment on Facebook that somebody wanted to put a slaughterhouse in Central. Look, there is no slaughterhouses that I've talked to. This is simply a conversation that me and the zoning commissioner had, and we went through the list, and we critiqued every single one and said, does this work in a RA district? That was it. There's no motive behind any of this. This is something that makes sense to me. So I wanted to do it. And now we're having a workshop about it, and it still makes sense. How do we fix it? It makes zero sense that Fraser's Homestead has horses that are boarded and stuff, but anybody else with 100 acres couldn't do the same thing he's doing right now within our law. And that, to me, makes no sense.
They can if they get a conditional use.
It's a conditional use. Yeah, they have to go and apply. So it's an RA zone where we typically want them to have horses and cattle. That's what they would do. But they can't board other people's horses. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, I'll tell you where it does make sense. It makes sense because we have RA zones that have 100 acres, or we have a property that's zoned RA that has, 3 acres.
But
acres.
we did that. We did that as a city. We had a motive to do that. Let's be honest about why we did it. We kept it at RA so we could control whatever ended up there. So that's part of our problem.
That's exactly right.
We kept things that shouldn't be RA, so we could stipulate what they did. And so now it's created another problem.
You're correct. The problem that was being tried that it was trying to solve as putting RA as a holding zone was to make sure that properties along commercial areas didn't become single stores or single commercial uses. The example I think is there was a lot of there was concern there were parts of Sullivan that had houses on it, but really were close to Walmart, and thought maybe they would be commercial. But there was a concern about properties becoming commercial one lot at a time, and that on Sullivan they left it residential, but on other parts in other parts of the city it was left RA, so that people would have to come in with a development, a commercial development, and not one property at a time, one lot at a time become commercial. David, yeah, I mean that was the thinking at the time, and obviously there are consequences from doing that.
But really and truly, right now in today's time, nothing on Sullivan Road should be RA.
I don't think anything on Sullivan Road is RA, but I was using that as an example. I think it was all left residential on Sullivan Road, but the concern about changing some of it to commercial would be that it would be piecemeal.
I mean, Summers Lane, that should be at least R1. It shouldn't be RA.
Also across the street from that, you got Sparkle, Leanne, Rome Avenue.
Yeah, you got a lot
that
of
as
more RA back there. I mean, it
and
just-
our two spots on mix.
So, I don't know, I mean, look, this is definitely a discussion that could take a life of its own about a lot of things. 'Cause
Yes.
what we did was, we took EBR stuff, we did a master plan, but then we reserved things back so we could control it, and now every time we have to change it, it creates an issue.
Well, that's why some things were zoned RA, but the master plan showed them as commercial.
Yeah.
Was excuse me?
Some things were zoned RA that were planned for multifamily to allow the council to review anything that's coming from like apartments, whatever. If we had zoned it R3, apartments could have came in by right. So we zoned it RA, so council would have say on it. That's one example.
Yeah. So and it's the same thing with the commercial developments, and that's, you know, it was to have control when things come in, but they might be planned under the master plan for what we really wanted to see there. But we're scared about rezoning it to that because of getting piecemeal development or getting, you know, piecemeal apartments going in. So that's why it was done that way.
I think we probably all have a feel of apartments this time.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Jennifer. I live in Morgan Place West. So what I'm saying, I really would like it to be in my neighborhood, but I understand the rural. I am an artist, and I would like for you to include artists and art lessons with a maximum of 6 students in an outbuilding. Because there, I mean, how quiet can we be, right? We're painting, we're giving lessons, anyway, I won't bring up anything that has to do with the subdivision or the occupational license like that, because I think that's another, would you say, Woodrow, a conditional thing? Conditional use? So with the arts, dancing, music, art lessons, that kind of thing.
And I personally see no issue with someone having art lessons out of their house.
Well, okay, right. So out of your house, but
Look, I agree. I think that the home-based business law that says you can't have an accessory building is silly. I think that.
Can we get that on the agenda somewhere?
I think you probably have universal agreement to get that done.
On that? Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I think that's why this conversation has taken a turn to a different approach. But I think the tiered system, like the stuff we're talking about in here, is very specific. You wouldn't want any of this in a recognized residential subdivision. So, I mean, except maybe art or dance. I mean, I don't have an issue with that.
So the race car person next to me can work on his cars as long as I have a meter of 100 decibels. I can report him to the police. I mean, that's the kind of thing that goes on in the neighborhood. But
I get them calls.
okay. So anyway, that was my point, if you could include more of the arts, in L.
All right, thank you.
Back again. While y'all were speaking, something came to my mind. Actually, I had this conversation before. I noticed that it went from 3 acres to 1 acre in, zoning, like 1 home per acre. I would like to see it back up to at least 3 acres in rural areas. And then also, if you're considering businesses for areas, perhaps consider the size of the lot with the type of business that's reciprocal for that, and the amount of space that particular business needs before zoning or laying down something or setting a precedence right now. I kind of feel in my own heart, in my own logic, that it needs a little bit more tinkering to it. And I'm just being honest, I am for growth, constructive, necessary growth. I am for home businesses. However, I do feel like there needs to be a little bit more detail to this. And, that's all I've got to add.
And I think I couldn't agree more with you. I think there's a lot of common sense in that too, right? So I'm RA right now. I'll put a dog kennel in front of my house, that's next to my neighbor's house, that's a bad deal. If I stick it all the way to the back, power lines and trees, we're the only people that will ever hear them dog. So I think you have to have.
I don't know, Shumack has kennels on the other side of me on Glenwatts Road, and I hear them every morning. Now, and I'm not knocking them.
Well, no, I'm
Chuck McCall trained my dog, he's great.
How do we respect our processes that are in place to make reasonable and smart decisions based on lot size?
I think
that's why these things are conditional uses.
Yeah.
So that particular development gets considered on a case-by-case basis, based on how much property you have.
Look, and that's what, when we was writing this, that's what I said. I don't want it allowed, I want it
Right, it's
conditional.
based on how much property you have, it's based on where you're gonna put it. So if you have a lot of property and you're gonna put a kennel, we don't want, you're gonna have to provide a site plan. We don't want you putting it, right across, 10 feet, 20 feet from your neighbor's house. If you're putting it way in the back where it's not near anybody, that's a different issue. And that's the point of it being a conditional use, so that those conditions can be put on the property and it can be considered, case by case, based on the size of the property, the location of the property. Because some things are appropriate and some things aren't.
While we're on the subject of conditional use, they scare the tar out of me, because what I've seen over the years is there seems to be a presumption, and it's probably just a matter of educating ourselves, is a presumption that a conditional use is okay in that zone. And it's almost like you have to find a big reason that you shouldn't allow a conditional use, when I think it should be the other way around. It should be the extreme exception. And around here, I can think of a lot of examples. It seems to me, well, it's on the list of conditional uses, so it's okay unless we can find a big problem with it. I personally, if I'm a landowner and I have 3 acres in a house, I don't want, not necessarily this council, the next one, I don't want 7 people looking at my house and saying, well, I think it's okay for that to go next to Dave's house. Well, you don't live next door to this. Y'all are, hopefully we're making good decisions, but conditional uses, I think we need to get a little, take a little.
Define the conditions.
Right, and that's what I brought up earlier, the way that's too generic, the way it's written. You have to have some controls, and I happen to agree with going back to 3 acres, by the way, kind of off subject. But I got a question while we got 2 lawyers here. You brought up something about not being able to rezone this property that's improperly zoned for our current city conditions. Now, from what I understand, Palermo versus Calcasieu Parish, the Supreme Court said that the courts are not going to get involved with zoning decisions in municipalities. So why are we getting so much resistance to rezoning some of this property that's improperly zoned for the way the city has grown? We got commercial property all over the place where it doesn't fit. That's why we got that Dollar General right now. So
So there's two issues there, okay? There's a couple of issues there. One is, once a property is zoned and somebody is operating at that property, or somebody has spent a lot of money to begin operating under that zoning, it's hard to take that zoning and change it. Well, I understand. It's not as simple as they did it.
Like a taking under the Constitution?
Well, it's right. It is a taking. So if somebody has an existing use and you want to close them down, I know. Well, this is part of the same thing. If somebody has an existing use and you want to close them down, you can, in theory, amortize them out of existence. But it's a process, okay, and it takes time. If somebody has, they call it a vested right. If they have taken steps and spent money and made efforts to operate under the current zoning, and you change it out from under them while they're in the process of doing that, and it's where along in the process have they done that, they may have a vested right to that use. And Palermo is an extreme case where I think the Supreme Court said they hadn't reached that point yet where they have a vested right. But well, then you can rezone it.
Right, that's what retained zoning, right?
Well, that particular property is retained zoning, which, as I said, I cringe every time there's a retained zoning thing that comes to me.
I don't know what that is.
It's
Don't go.
you don't want to know.
Don't go.
Yeah. So whatever. It's not that easy to just rezone property before somebody has invested. Or it is easy to change it before somebody has invested, but after they've invested in their development, it's not that easy to change.
So I got to make a comment. It was a famous TV show years ago. I guess I'm showing you how old I am. And if you said the magic word, like bells went off or something. Yeah, and whenever anybody says the word Palermo at a public meeting about zoning, all the bells go off. I was there. Okay, I've written law review articles on it. I've taught it for 35 years, and if you want to come to my class, it's on Thursday nights at 6 o'clock at UNO, starting next Thursday. I let anybody come if you want to come. Okay, 14 weeks. We get to Palermo about week 7. We spend 3 weeks on Palermo. Okay, so Palermo says you can change zoning, and it does say the courts don't like getting involved with local decision because they give the power to the legislative body, because nobody knows central like central. Okay, what the case says is you can change zoning, but you better do it the right way. And come to my class if you want to know what the right way is. Central knows how to do it the right way, and you do it the right way. But we'll just leave it at that.
Donnie Fusler, 9542 Overwood Drive. First off, Palermo versus Calcasieu. I knew the Palermo involved. It's Mr. Joe Palermo. He's a very good friend of mine. Passed away a few years ago, but I'll tell y'all, he's smiling and laughing up there hearing people talk about him right now. It seems that the direction that this is going to head into is modifying the Unified Development Code and uses, which has not been modified and updated since 2014. And that seems like where we're heading with this. And Wade, whenever you introduced this item, I told you then, I think this is a great discussion. I said it at P&Z, I said it at council, I'll say it here. I think this is a great discussion. I think it's a discussion that needs to happen. Obviously, we're not going to work everything out here tonight by any means. This is something that's going to have to go in depth, because this opens the Pandora's box. We go from talking about conditional uses and rural ag zoning to now we're talking about modifying our home business ordinance to where, like I said, where it's going to go is we're going to have to update our Unified Development Code and that. So my question, though, is So, Mr. Balkin, you said you cannot rezone property if there is an existing business, for instance, there.
You can rezone it. You can rezone it, but they're gonna be able to continue to operate as a legal non-conforming
Correct.
use.
So let me ask you, so I fought Dollar General next to Village Lakes tooth and dead gum nail. That was, and forgive me for it, P&Z members in here, that was an absolutely poor decision by the city. And yes, we can rely on the city to make decisions, but we have decisions like that. We have a storage building complex being built in front of Shoe Creek that should have been prime real estate and restaurants to generate tax revenue for the city. Councilman Furneaux, Councilman Evans both voted against that and agreed with me on that. So we can't always rely on the city. I mean, I'm a city official. I sit on the Board of Adjustment. I chair it. I don't always make the world's smartest decisions. I'll own that. So we can't always rely on that. But let me ask you though, before that Dollar General ever became a deal, so this was 19 acres, one tract of land, back half was zoned residential, front half of it was zoned commercial. It's been like that since before we became a city. Could the city have honestly stepped in and rezoned that property before there was a plan for it? Before Mr. Kimball sold it to Dollar General? Because if the city can do that, as several of the council up here said, we have several properties that are like that, and if we can, then the council needs to step in and do it and prevent something like Dollar General next to Village Lakes happening again.
And I'm saying this based on my memories of exactly what happened with the Dollar General, not looking at any of my notes. Okay, but just the problem with the Dollar General was that the Dollar General was it was a retained commercial zone of the district from EBR zoning. It was one of those properties that was retained zoning, and what they were doing with the Dollar General was fit that zoning. They didn't need a variance, they didn't need a conditional use, they didn't need a rezoning. All they needed to do was get a building permit. But before they could get a building permit, they had to subdivide the property. And they really probably didn't have to subdivide the property. But they chose to subdivide the property. And the subdivision met all of the criteria. And the city did not have the authority. I mean, you could have, but would have lost because there was no basis to deny the subdivision. The subdivision met the subdivision code. They could have built the Dollar General, come in and got building permits and built the Dollar General, and then sought the subdivision. We actually, if I remember correctly, tried to do some things to protect the back of that property and how the driveways were going to be done as part of that subdivision. But there wasn't a lot of authority because it met the zoning. They didn't need any approvals other than a building permit. So that's the problem with the retained zones, and that's why the staff and I, and I'm sure some of you all have had discussions about, let's look at these retained zones again and let's start changing them to put it under our zoning. I don't even think it was big enough. The Dollar General was big enough that it required site plan approval.
Let me come to P&Z's defense on this, because they've taken a beating over this over and over and over. They actually did an extremely good job for us, given that the Dollar General was going to go there whether we liked it or not. They actually got the rest of the property, if I'm not mistaken, TJ, the rest of the property taken out of that commercial status. So what could have been acres and acres of commercial is now limited to that one building. And that was the best win we could get out of the situation. I compliment P&Z on that.
I think we should stop doing the Dollar General. That's not what we're here for.
Yeah.
But there needed to be some explanation as to.
Well, the question to you was, can we look at properties right now without it being a taking and saying, well, yeah, there's a commercial over here on Hubs.
Absolutely.
We just want to rezone that.
We could rezone the whole city if we wanted to.
We've done that.
And so we should be looking at those properties that are either retained zoning or properties that are zoned RA because of what we were trying to protect previously and are planned differently, and we should look at those and see which ones of those properties, and then we give notice to the people whose property it is, and we hold a public hearing, and we can rezone those properties to what we think is appropriate. Absolutely, we can do that.
What if they fight it? Can they fight it?
There's
no doubt we can do it.
They can fight. The harder part is when do they fight? So with Dollar General, they had bought the property. They had done up the plans. Right. No, but so you got to get out in front of these things. Okay, and so it takes us a while to rezone property. We have to have hearings. We have to do it. But the answer is if they say I don't want my property rezoned, we can still rezone it. Absolutely.
But I mean, we have the right to take it's retained zoning from EDR. Butcher, you can work on a list. Thank you.
Yeah, we can rezone any property in the city, and if it's vacant, they're only going to be able to develop it under the new zoning.
So that was my question.
They won't have vested rights to the old zoning.
But the safe thing would be to do it before somebody puts a bunch of money into the property.
Well, let me say,
exactly. That's the key. That's when you get into the takings issue.
Hang on a second. Look, I own 4 acres of commercial property, and I bought it primarily. The reason I bought it is because my neighborhood, my house backs up to it. I want to be able to control what goes back there. It's zoned commercial, and I paid a really high price for it because it's zoned commercial. If anybody undoes that, I'm going to have a problem.
Is it zoned through EDR code or through Central code?
Central did it.
Okay, we're looking at things that are still under EDR code that may not even be considered a code record. There's property that was never transferred over into Central's code.
But still, somebody may have paid a premium price for that property because it was zoned commercial.
It is Central's code. We adopted those and made those our code. So those are some obsolete Central codes that we wrote in ordinances because they were there at the time. But we adopted those codes. So they are our codes.
You can go from C1 to B1 and it still be commercial property, just under our current code.
But my point is, we got to be careful not to diminish the value of somebody's property.
Right,
Like they paid a price for it because it was zoned that way,
But it would still be considered commercial. It just wouldn't be C1.
But whatever we change it to, we can't affect the value of it.
Well, but at times too, I mean, what has to be considered is you may affect the value of the property, but it may be what is best for Central and the surrounding areas. And Councilman Furneaux, thank you for bringing it back to my point. Well, my point I was trying to ask was the 15 to 16 years before Kimball sold his property to Dollar General, could the city have stepped in and done something?
But Kimball also, remember, he paid a premium because of the commercial zoning on the property as well. So do we then pay them for that, or do we say, no, you're done, we're taking it from you? I mean, that's a whole nother workshop.
It is.
The question of a taking,
There are a bunch of y'all here, Mark. You don't have to say
The question about a taking is actually not whether you diminish somebody's property value. It's whether you take substantially all of the value of the property away. And there's lots of cases, federal cases, probably some state cases too, about how much of the value of it do you have to change. But the fact of the matter is, that property that you bought commercial and you haven't done anything with, we could rezone it R1, and you probably wouldn't be able to win. I'm sure you couldn't win a case about it. So rezoning a person's property that they bought that was commercial, that's a political issue. It's not really a legal issue.
I did get away from my point that I actually came up here to say. So we have talked about a lot of things, noise, property rights, and when they infringe on somebody else's. Another thing that possibly isn't being taken into effect as well is the safety aspect of some of these proposed businesses. So some of these, such as a cabinet shop, an abattoir, a slaughterhouse, some of these businesses have very dangerous equipment. And one thing that if we're going to lay conditions on them, one of those needs to be fencing. Because, you got Mr. Johnson next door who he's operating a cabinet shop. And, you got little Timmy, 8-year-old Timmy next door, and he hears all the noise and he wants to go see what Mr. Tommy's doing. You know, he goes in there and, you know, he didn't see the kid come in. Next thing you know, that kid has gotten hurt. And that's something as well. I mean,
Is that the parents' problem?
Yeah, where's Timmy Pop?
But I mean, at the same time, I mean,
I'm not building a fence around my pond because the neighbor's kid may wander over.
I'm not thinking him 15
But,
acres.
well, at least just around that. But I mean, that is something that has to be thought about. And then, like I've said before, I brought this up, you know, entertainment venues with a 250 person capacity. You know, when's the cutoff at night? Where are 250 people going to park? Where is the visibility? Where, you know, there's so many
Well, obviously,
things to think about.
if you have an events facility with a 250 person capacity, you would have to have adequate parking. You'd have to have adequate bathrooms. You'd have to still meet all the other standards.
Correct.
All of that would still have to comply. So if you have a 1 acre tract, you don't have enough room.
Correct.
If you have a 10 acre tract, then you probably have a better shot of doing something. If you have a 20 acre tract, I mean, so that's why it's all conditional. So how do we? That's what we need to do is codify it to where it is conditional. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Hooper.
I just wanted to say that while you're talking about this, don't forget access.
Correct.
Because if you had a banquet facility at your place, you'd have a heck of a time with that road. Let's not forget the
Right,
access.
we wouldn't let them go down Washington Lane.
Yeah, they can't come to my house. That's why I moved back there, so nobody comes back.
So what?
That is condition.
So
That
what-
needs to be a condition as well.
So what is the next step in this process? Who's taking this and moving forward and with all this input? I think are we ready to say this is where this needs to head?
And I don't mean it, I'll speak loud enough that way I don't have to get back up again. If y'all could take into consideration the overall vision of what our community should look like, how you want it to look, versus how it seems like things are getting flipped over a little bit at a time. Either the planning and zoning is responsible or the council is responsible. But if y'all could just take a look at overall vision for our community, maybe from previous administrations, of what aesthetically how you would want it to look and how you would want it to, you know, work together.
All right. So from this conversation, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ms. Smith.
I was politely waiting my turn, and then he
Jump on in
tried
there,
to turn
girl.
it. I was like, wait. Okay, I have a question that some other people may have as well. So, as far as RA zone, I was told if I wanted to open up my real estate business, which I'm not, everybody, I'm just using it as an example, I would not be able to come to zoning or council or whatever and say I want to rezone my property. Correct or not correct?
You could rezone it.
Okay. But I couldn't come, okay, let me rephrase that. I'm sorry, I knew that answer. But if I wanted to come to you and say, I would like to apply for a conditional use to operate a real estate company
Not
out of
currently.
my home with one employee,
Not current.
why can't that happen?
Well,
That
so
almost seems like
this conversation was necessary. So here's the direction. Since I sponsored this, I'm going to follow up. I'm looking at the Zachary thing, and Matt, if you can email me this so I can then email it to anyone that wants it, because, and I'm just going to run through it right quick. So they have a staff level approval. The home office occupation should be conducted entirely within the dwelling and shall be clearly incidental and secondary to the use of the dwelling for residential purposes. No home occupation may be operated in an accessory structure. The home office occupation is limited to 15% of the floor area of the unit, and it goes through a whole list. Then you go to Tier 2. Tier 2, you can have it in an accessory structure. The accessory structure cannot be more than 30% of the size of the primary structure. Any vehicles or equipment have to be stored in an enclosed structure. And it goes on down. Retail sales are limited to products produced on site, so maybe a little wood shop or something. Then there's kennel, pet daycare, institutional residential, but then I would like to see us add a Tier 2 for RA, because I think RA needs to be a little less restrictive than, say, a R2. So maybe the accessory structure can be 50% of the home's size. And because with the tier 2, it's 2 employees. Maybe with RA, you step up the number of employees and just have a little more freedom based on the size of your property and based on whether or not you're going to interfere, with your neighbor's setting.
Okay, so I agree with Dave Furneaux. Where, sorry Dave, I love you, but I'm like, wow, I actually agreed with him. In that, sometimes when it's put into the ordinance that this is an acceptable conforming use, it's an automatic. It was put in there, everybody must think it's okay, let's just go ahead and approve it. And I mean nothing against anyone, council or zoning in that fact, because some people do look very hard into everything before they make a decision. But I'm not even considering any of you or any of the zoning. I'm considering 10 years from now. It's not just right now that we have to look at. But I agree with most everything that's been said as far as need more detail, so on and so forth. So then going back to my other question is, if these are put into the conforming use under RA, then they still have to, I'm sorry, I don't mean conditional use.
Not allowed.
I've been
It's
thinking
very
conforming in my head for another reason for a minute.
It's conditional.
Conditional use.
Yeah.
If it's put in there, then the people still have to come in front of zoning or council to gain that approval, correct?
Yes.
Both. So that's a safety feature there. Just get that out on the books. But I'm going to also add that in your current proposed ordinance, sorry, I've got way too many papers here. You start out saying a maximum of 8 employees, and then you say, but the bakery can only have 4. This can only have 2.
So the
It
reason,
needs to be.
the reason that was in there like that, Tara, is because if you think we were talking on-site employees,
Right.
and that was the issue. Not like if you've got a guy who has a janitorial company, my friend Phil Pike, he has 50 employees. They don't come to his house. He stores toilet paper and stuff.
Right.
But they all go to jobs. So, I mean, he should be able to have 50 employees. He's not parking 50 cars at his house.
Agreed.
And, today he wouldn't be allowed to do what he's doing. He's been doing it long enough, thankfully, that he can.
A lot of the home-based business
My
needs to be.
concern is, is Central becoming a city that don't allow the things that were allowed, that made us the reason people want to be here. Phil Pike bought his property on Thibodeau Road because he could do what he was doing. Are we getting away from that? Is that where we want to go? I even made the comment, if that's the direction we want to go, then don't have RA zoning. Change it all to R1. So either we figure out what got us to where we are and try to make it work. And that was the goal, is to make it work. How do we fix it to where it encourages people to not move out of Central so they can have their small business on their rural property?
Okay, and then another suggestion is to take slaughterhouse out of there, please.
But
you don't have to comment on that. That was just my comment.
I have no issue removing slaughterhouse from it.
But I'm going to go to no. So everything is geared towards no retail. Home-based businesses need to be able to operate. Plumbers need to be able to operate out of their back accessory building. And I still don't get the whole they can't have trucks on their property. I don't understand that, but eventually everybody's going to get there. But neighbors are our safety feature. Neighbors. If they've grown to the capacity where they're disturbing their neighbors, then that's when they need to pick up and move and go somewhere else. And I say move, they can still live there, but if you've got that many employees and you're that big where you're disrupting your neighbors, it's time to get a bigger facility. So most of these, you focus entirely on no retail. Primarily, I'm assuming, because of traffic in and out, correct?
I don't want to change the rural landscape at all.
But for retail, primarily for the traffic in and out,
and
correct?
It changes the rural landscape, and I don't want retail out where it's not needed. I mean, we have retail inside of the area for a reason. I mean, you got fire protection. There's a lot of infrastructure issues with having retail.
So I say this with all due respect to everyone in here who it may apply to. Please don't take it personal, but no retail, in and out traffic, doesn't that go to the reception centers? Event halls?
Here's
250 cars in and out on a rural tract piece of land?
So, but it's on a state highway.
In a curve with bad lighting. I mean, I'm not picking on the receptions. I think they have a beautiful place. I think it is a well thought, well planned business, and I do hope it prospers. But like I told you before in one of our other meetings, do they really need 250 people? Could you cap it to 50 people? What is their average amount of people that come in and out? Because there's people who are actually adjoining their property who can't be here. I'm missing my daughter's cheer thing tonight because I wanted to be there for them and for RA as a whole.
Well, we're not approving them tonight.
Right. No, but to have I guess I'm pointing out the differences.
We need to discuss it though, because there are rural barn centers. There's one in
oh, I think it's a fabulous addition to the city of Central. I do.
Done ceremonies
but with stipulations.
One in Clinton. I mean, so there are ways to deal with that.
Right, but most of the zoning rules, though, again, City of Central really does need to look at a lot of things on the zoning aspect. But there's things that are implemented in those zoning classifications to protect the surrounding areas. Better lighting, traffic control, turn lanes, and I'm not talking about just reception at this point, I'm talking all. Those are all there for a reason. Home-based businesses are totally different. When you're looking at a small electrical company, a bug man, a real estate company, an attorney who has one assistant, those things shouldn't apply. But when you have that big of a business, and I'm not putting it with retail, but going back to my appraisal days, a reception center in a million years would not be found in the middle of acreage tract properties residentially owned or utilized, should I say, residentially utilized.
So you can't build a barn inside the city. Our overlay district won't allow you to build a barn. So if somebody wants to get married, excuse me, Councilwoman, you got something to say?
Yeah, on Jewel Road, there is property that you can, that's not where homes are, where residents are, and I feel like you continue to say that, and I wasn't gonna say anything, but there is a big difference between operating a home business and then changing your home into a business on the weekends whenever you have neighbors around you.
Every weekend
I think we
for
need to
certain
look at the
months.
master plan, and if there's things that we think need to be changed with zoning, then it should, but changing rural zoning and going about it from the rural zoning instead of home-based business, so we're just gonna go around town changing zoning because somebody wants to open up a business?
I think we've headed in a different direction.
So my point was, I believe that the traffic in and out, that's the point I was trying to focus on. My apologies, I did not promise you mean to single out any one entity, but I believe what we're looking at as a whole.
Should we do a traffic count? I mean, I'm asking a rhetorical question.
Well, let me partially answer it for you. This is not a small piece of code you're talking about writing. Small pieces of code. If you think you can get this done in 2 pages and meet everything we've talked about tonight, forget it. This is 30 pages of code. And it's lazy for us to write a short piece of code and then say, well, we'll just figure it out later. This is the type of thing we're going to have to actually say, no, you got to have a 200-foot buffer for this kind of business. You got to have a 1,000-foot buffer for this one. You have to have this traffic count. This is going to be a large project if it's done right. So let's don't be lazy and not anticipate all of the little circumstances in this. If we're going to do this, let's do it right.
Of course, I agree.
Dave, if you keep talking, somebody's going to keep it moving.
It's because I'm not running.
So my last
That's exactly right.
So my last concern, and I said this at the council meeting, is when you start, so the attorneys and some other people were talking about the use carrying with the owner and not the land. Not quite sure, I'm so not an attorney. How do you do that without opening the city up to some sort of liability? If you've got a bakery, I'm not gonna use the other example, if you've got a bakery over here or this over here, and if they've got a conditional use that's carried with the owner, well, if someone a mile down the road wants to do the same thing, but they, again, this is where the track sizes, visual, traffic, et cetera, can come into play, but how can you, does it end up becoming a conforming use? And I might not be using the right word, but in the appraisal world, and I've been out of that world for about 12 years now, but when you have an existing business operating, it typically dictates what is approved around it. Kind of like what she was saying. You've got this business here, you've got this business here. Would that affect my rezoning? In my opinion, I would say, not being an attorney or on the council or zoning, that yes, it would. If you've got surrounding businesses around you, more likely than not, I would venture to say that the council is going to approve some sort of rezoning that would correspond with the surrounding properties.
That's part of the reason we don't like to do spot zoning.
Right.
Because it changes the overall character of the zoning area.
So then by doing these, and I said
and that's
conforming
why
use.
post offices and fire and police. Now, Steve said we don't even have to follow our own zoning code for municipal stuff. But on Lovett Road, there's the fire station's on heavy commercial. So everybody around it's like, well, why can't I have commercial? We've got commercial right here. And my point is, a fire station should be able to happen in any zone.
Agreed.
Police and post office. Go to the Pride Post Office. It's pretty rural.
Pride? I don't want to go out
It's
that far.
all
That's
right.
way
I
out
think to
there.
answer your question, how do you tie it to the business and not the land? We throw money at attorneys till they figure it out.
And-
So
but
we'll get it done.
So then just a fact to keep in mind is not as an appraiser, but if an appraiser were to go out and appraise properties and
It's a
And they
residence.
see that these
It's a
businesses-
residence. It's not a business. It shouldn't be appraised as a business.
primarily a residence
It's a
first.
residence with a building.
So that's how you avoid the appraiser going,
Yeah, I
well,
mean,
we've
this
got
is a
surrounding
home-based
properties
business.
here.
Yeah, this is not a commercial property.
But I think
Yeah.
some of these in here are no longer home-based businesses and should be deemed commercial.
But at what point?
That we'll figure that out and say this is the line. Once we
That's-
cross this line, it's now a
Because-
rezone.
All right, so let's, the bakery. The bakery comes up. For years, we bought cakes from a lady that had she baked cakes in her kitchen, right here off Sullivan Road. And she had a lady that came and helped her. She couldn't do that today because she had a lady that came and helped her that did live with her. And to me, that's ridiculous. So how do you solve that problem? So when I wrote this, when I put this together, we were looking at in an RA zone, what makes sense. That was it. That's why bakeries got put in it. And I said for employees. Yeah, no subdivision. So, I mean, I don't know. I had no idea there would be such a firestorm about something so seemingly simple.
It seems as if though the consensus is home-based businesses that's where it needs to start. Because there's way too many restrictions on home-based businesses that are truly home-based businesses. And here's your list. So I mean, like a bed and breakfast, that's my own opinion. Slaughterhouse, please, y'all don't approve of the slaughterhouse. Plumbers,
Let's just take
contractors,
slaughterhouse
electricians,
off
you
our
think about these
list
businesses that
completely.
you talked about, Wade, trade construction, yes, they started in their garage, are they still there? No, because it would have affected the.
No, they're on a rural agricultural piece
And
of
that's
property.
fine, but I mean, when did they build that? Because I can't remember, was that before city
It
became
was
essential?
rural ag, and then it was zoned ORD.
It was after city became essential that trade built on Drawer?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
We rezoned that property.
And he has to get a conditional
that's
use
y'all's fault,
permit
not
for
y'all, but
everything he
y'all.
does.
I know, I'm being silly. But, I mean, look, yeah, I guess, I mean,
I was trying to bring some common sense to the whole code issue. That was it. That's
needs a
fine.
lot more
And
detail.
that's fine, Mike.
And
So they
that's
got-
why I wanted your input, and I still do.
You're saying, and Sarah was talking about.
Allison, please go to the microphone.
She said she would.
She keeps saying she's done. Can we just get her a
I
mic?
guess what she was saying, about the reception center in a residential area, I'd like to turn your attention to Beck Barn off of Droz Road. It is in my own nephew, beautiful little boy, I'm just bragging, had his birthday there. It is in a residential area. You have a house in the front, you have a barn, and then she also, I guess they train horses and everything. But Greenville Springs, that little park right there with GSYR, Greenville Springs Youth, and something I grew up and around with my own family, Central still has their boots on. And that's okay to have something like that as long as it's not hurting the neighbors. However, I feel that having, say, what Johnny was stating earlier, an updated unified development code, whoever wants to come in and have a business, those things are in place to where when y'all come in to write, ordinances like this, that it gives you more of a template to work with on what you want to put a precedence on. I do feel like there should be, just to reiterate for a moment, more adjustment on 3 acres, the types of businesses, not only looking at the type of business that's coming in or what they plan on doing, but considering what it takes to run that business, and do they have enough space to do it? Do they have enough employees to do it? Because in order for a business to run properly, you have to have adequate staff and productivity and everything like that. But I guess it can be done, but you don't want it to get out of control. So I have seen it done in a residential area, a little reception, but it wasn't out of control. And I think with living in rural areas such as me, you don't want it to get out of control. You don't want someone coming to build behind you and, I'm going to do a wedding venue, but they're in the middle of rural agriculture. That echo carries, and then it's hitting your neighbors' houses, and all they hear is boom, boom, boom every other weekend. So I guess that's what I'm saying, just to add on to what she was saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I can make a comment, I enjoy listening to folks because I think you learn more when your mouth's closed than when it's open. And also, I don't think I'm the smartest person in the world, so sometimes it's best to keep your mouth closed rather than open it. And people think you're cool rather than open it to remove all doubt. But I've learned a lot today myself. I think a tiered approach is definitely a way to go. Start with some type of home-based business, tier 1, something like Zachary's doing, maybe a few more tiers. And then we're able to kind of control that growth. And as things get bigger, we have more restrictions, oversight, things that we can look at. I think that's critical. So I think this is a good start. I know you've been beat up for this way, but I think if you didn't bring it, we may not even be here talking about this.
I'm okay with it.
So I appreciate you putting this piece of crap together so that we can discuss it.
Where's the attorney that wrote it?
I'm kidding, Wade, but a little bit. But I think this allowed us to have this discussion. And this may not be the last workshop. Maybe something's put together that we can, again, come and discuss and try to figure out more how we can effectively set forth a plan that will kind of meet the needs of our community and make sure we're looking towards the future, not just short-sighted on things. Because I expect our community is going to continue to grow. And I moved to Central 14 years ago, almost 15 years ago, because I liked the community here and how it was. I'm not chugging up. I don't know what happened. But and I hadn't really eaten anything today because I was in court most of the day. Anyway, so I appreciate this conversation and really look forward to trying to work because there's some things in our code that just don't make sense, especially with the home-based businesses and accessory building. Those are simple things we can kind of move out, and then we can kind of get a little bigger, a little larger scale on some things and try to just work through.
Yeah, and I would like for us to not lose sight of the whole occupational license requirement as something additional we could do that we were talking about earlier. Because I think we definitely need to define the conditions that we can impose for different size and types of businesses, different size of property. Because there's a lot of people, certainly in District 5, that have been operating businesses out of their barns and sheds for years. And there's a lot of people that want to bring their small businesses back to Central that currently can't do that. And so if we put together a good plan that looks at
the home-based businesses and gets into defining some conditions for those other types of businesses, then I would fully support something like this. It was a good idea to be brought up, and it's something that we can all, there's a lot of smart people talking about it, and I think we can definitely come up with something that'll be beneficial to the city while still protecting the rights of the neighboring property owners.
All right, I agree. Thank you.
Thanks, Wade, for letting everybody beat up on you.
It's good.
It's a good conversation. It
I
really
like
is.
it. I got big shoulders. All right, well, then I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Meeting adjourned.